I am Gardner. This is my film, Quake 2, a love story.
One gigantic picture.
You like? I don't care if you like! Quake 2 for Nintendo 64 und PlayStation Game Console.
Hey everyone, welcome to a brand new series called West vs. Backlog Retro, where we go and take a look at games that I used to play growing up, all the way until the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and regular Xbox generation. And in this first installment, I couldn't really think of a better game to get us going than Quake 2, a game that released at the end of 1997, and not only did it set a standard on graphic fidelity, not only for PC games, but for the future of 3D video games, period. So for this, I'll be primarily showing footage captured via my Steam copy of the game, running a mod called Ultimate Quake 2, which allowed us to capture at 1080p at 60 frames a second, while also enabling some of my favorite kind of old school graphic options from back in the day. It also made sure that the soundtrack actually plays, as the default Steam release has no music, due to the way that the music would read from the physical disc. And I'll put a link to the mod in this description, as I highly recommend it for the Steam copy of the game. So the gameplay is pretty standard fare for this era in 1997, and it has key cards, maze-like environments, boss battles, and awesome weapons. Basically, if you're used to the original Quake, or even the Doom games, there's a lot of that similarity here. However, for me, this was the game that really fine-tuned what it started with Doom and Quake, becoming almost a game template that other developers used going forward for many years to come. You can't talk about Quake 2 without talking about the weapons. And while the super shotgun is kind of the gun that everybody says is the bee's knees, and the game is most remembered for that, I really fell in love using the single-shot shotgun, as it did great damage, but it still preserves some of your ammo, because the super shotgun was great, but for every mouse click, you used 2 shells instead of the single shot, which only used the 1, and you would end up running out of ammo in a hurry. Of course, it's always awesome to play with the stuff like the railgun and the BFG, but looking back, and as time has passed, I'd argue that I preferred how those guns played in Quake 3 Arena and Team Arena a little better. So, something that blew me away as a kid about Quake 2 were the explosions in the particle systems, which rendered out trails from bullets and rockets, and showed, explosions of barrels, using actual 3D polygons instead of the two-dimensional sprites that you would be used to. Back in 1997, we barely had a computer that could play Rebel Assault, much less Quake 2 at a decent speed. And I remember skimming through old gaming magazines like PC Gamer and Computer Gaming World, and seeing all the ads for the 3DFX Voodoo graphics card. And I really wanted one, because that was kind of the way that Quake 2 was meant to be played. So the level design itself is pretty well done for this era, and I actually felt like the game aged pretty well. So puzzles still took a little bit of thinking, levels connected in logical ways, and near the end of the game, it was actually nice to see that science fiction, cathedral, Victorian era stuff that Quake 3 Arena and Team Arena were known for. The music is fantastic. It was composed by Sonic Mayhem, who actually did a fan soundtrack for Quake 1, I believe, and then just got hired on by id to make the soundtrack officially for Quake 2. It very much feels like a Nine Inch Nails album. My favorite Nine Inch Nails album is The Downward Spiral, and this literally just sounds like B-cuts from The Downward Spiral. And it has grinding and chugging riffs, and it plays really well whenever you're kind of ripping through the hordes of the Strogg. and it gives the game a great pulse to kind of push you forward through the levels. So as part of the West vs. Backlog Retro, what I would really like to do is kind of take a look at different versions of the same game to see how they differ. So Quake 2 actually had 2 console ports, both released in 1999, so about a year and a half after the original game did. And there was one port released for the Nintendo 64, and the other was for the original PlayStation, and I actually have footage from both, and I want to talk about both of them for a second. So I'll start with a quick overview of the Nintendo 64 version. So apparently it was built using the same engine that they used to make Quake 1 on the N64, and they went in and they edited and made it more extensive with the lighting and the rendering techniques look a little better. It looks pretty great. It reminds me of Turok 2, but in space. As you can see, the textures are definitely N64-esque. They look a little muddier. They're not as high fidelity, especially when we look at the PlayStation 1 version. But it definitely feels like an N64 game. So the game itself is entirely different. So the levels aren't even the same. They do share enemies and the same guns, but levels are quite a bit smaller. There's not very many, if any, outdoor areas, and the guns look about the same. They're fairly equivalent, but each level is quite a bit shorter. One cool aspect is that you can fully change the controller to be whatever configuration you want. You can actually go in and tell each individual button what it should do. So I was playing through an emulator, so I set my controller to be set up almost like a Call of Duty or Halo. And it felt really well. It felt good. I think it's a pretty solid port. Even if the game is entirely different, I think it has the attitude and the flair to really feel like Quake 2. So for the original PlayStation version, fun fact, this was the first way I really played Quake 2 to completion. I had played the Quake 2 demo on PC, but it was the original PlayStation version that I was really able to kind of dig in and beat the game. And it was my main console version. And I was super happy to see that it aged really well. It was still a lot of fun to play. The textures, in my opinion, look really great. And 3D PlayStation 1 games had this jagged polygonal texture warping thing. And it's all over this in Quake 2. But it made me smile because that's what I remember. In my mind's eye, it matches. So it actually reminds me of a highly detailed Medal of Honor game set in sci-fi universe. But the cool thing is the load times were really quick. The layout of the levels actually mimic the computer version pretty well. So I would be playing through the PC version, then hop over to the emulated PS1 version, and a lot of the same places for keys and items, they were all there. So I would say this is the more accurate port for the console versions. But it is still a little smaller. It couldn't be as vast as the PC version. But I love the way the lighting looks in the PlayStation 1 version because the colors really pop. I definitely say this is my favorite console release of Quake 2. But the good news is, whether it's N64 or PlayStation 1, it's still fun. Both versions are still a lot of fun. Now, as a side note, there was also a pretty great version of Quake 2 that was made as a pack-in for the Xbox 360 release of Quake 4, and it runs at a solid 1080p 60 frames a second, which for the Xbox 360 is pretty good. So it'll give you a similar experience to a modded PC version, I guess. So it's definitely a cool little thing. If you have it, definitely check it out. So overall, I loved going back to play through Quake 2, so much so that I actually completed the game. Me, Mr. Notorious, never beat anything. I've been on a good roll lately, but yeah, I actually finished Quake 2. I think Steam says I have about 6 hours of played time on it. It is a bona fide classic. It aged very well. It helped pave the way for all games after it, because this was one of the first games that really focused its production on 3D hardware acceleration and really utilizing that as far as a technology. And they did creative ways of doing texture filtering and mapping and things like that. So it was really pushing the envelope, especially in 1997. I will do a shout out. Digital Foundry has a video series called Digital Foundry Retro, where they actually do like a 30-minute breakdown of all of the ins and outs of Quake 2, and they look really in-depth on how the N64 and the PS1 render stuff. They even look at some Dreamcast stuff, which I didn't even know was a thing. But if you really want to get down to the technical nitty-gritty and all of the inside scoops of Quake 2 and how it was developed, definitely go check it out. I'll put a link to it in the description for the video, but I highly recommend it. So if you want to purchase Quake 2, you can pick it up directly on Steam for about $4.99. I didn't see anywhere to buy the mission packs for it, but it may be built in. I need to double check that. You could also go to Good Old Games, GOG.com, and it's part of the Quake 2 Quad Damage release, which does come with the mission packs, both The Reckoning and Ground Zero. And they actually have what's called a net pack, which is a collection of mods and deathmatch mods that were handpicked by id Software themselves as saying like this is the cream of the crop. And you can get that for about $10, so pretty good deal on that, and it will run on modern systems. So I think that's going to do it for the first ever Wes vs. Backlog Retro. Let me know what you think in the comments about Quake 2. Do you have the affinity for it the same way I do? Let me know. You can always hit me up on Twitter at twitter.com/commiedahobo. You can also hit me up on the brand new Facebook page at facebook.com/commiedahobo. Of course, if you go to commiedahobo.com, you'll get all the past episodes, podcasts, everything there, all in one nice place for you. But guys, that's a wrap for this time, and until next time, peace.